Okay, this is Idiot with a Library Card. This is going to be the last of a 3-episode series I've done on what I'm calling library stories. The first, if you haven't listened, was about drag queen story time at a local library. The last one was just kind of my general feelings on library fees and some libraries in different cities going to a no late fee policy and forgiving late fees. So I think that's actually an interesting show, but it sounds terribly boring. This one is a story that's been around for a while, not too long. I mean, it came out in April. I wanted to cover it just because it was a library story, and I found it interesting when I heard it. So how this is going to work is I'm just going to read this article. It's not very long, but I'll just read it and then throw comments in. When I'm reading it, I'll say quote or back to the article. This article... and it's been covered by people like Benjamin Boyce, who's a YouTuber and a really interesting guy. I'd say look him up. He did a whole series on the Evergreen College eruption 2 years ago now. But he does all sorts of stuff, and he's not a super famous YouTube guy, but he's really good, and I would suggest his videos. He's excellent. He's very interesting. Mostly on the topic, I would say, of academics, but he's veered into, lately he's been doing a lot of transgender cultural issues, which have been pretty good too. So, this article, it's come out of a few places. I found it on the author's WordPress page, but it's been in some publications, library publications. There are trade magazines for librarians, just like everyone else. But yes, there's a trade magazine, a few trade magazines for librarians. And actually, she runs one, I would call it a trade website, kind of for social justice librarians, which you know I'm about. Okay, so I'm just going to read through the article and give you my opinions and sort of what I think of it. And there's a lot of other people who've given their opinions, but I actually find the article quite interesting. So I'm going to link it in the... description as well, if you want to read it for yourself. If you find my reading skills aren't that good, they're not, especially out loud, so please bear with me. And so here we go. So, Sophia Leung, she's a library's social justice and critical race theory, which is, I think, the title of the article, but also sort of subtitle and in bolder letters, Whiteness as Collections. Quote from the article. I had this interesting mini eureka moment a few weeks ago that I wanted to share for a few reasons. One, I don't usually reflect on the connections that help me understand how I learn something new or what goes into coming up with some new concept. Most of the time, the connections aren't clear to me. Two, I like to show students that inspiration for new research or scholarly ideas don't have to come from only scholarly publications. 3, I need to write it out to fully understand how I came to this conclusion and to really understand what this conclusion means. Now, I sort of agree with all 3 points there. I don't think it's very clear to any of us how we come up with the ideas we do. Sometimes we do have these like, oh my God, I just figured it out because I read this book or something. But a lot of times it's different influences in our lives that give us ideas. Like for this podcast, it was a few different things. I had some other ideas for podcasts, and this just seemed like the best medium for me. I also agree with her that research or scholarly ideas don't necessarily need to come from scholarly publications. There's a lot of different inspirations out there, even in the scholarly world. Now, I am not a scholar or a university student, so I don't have a degree in anything. I have a high school diploma as my highest education. So, you know, I haven't done a ton of scholarly research or writing, but I think I understand where she's coming from. And the third part, now I don't include this in the podcast. I try to shape it. But a lot of times these podcasts are how I figure things out, how I think about books. It makes it better. It's really cleared up my thoughts on certain things, just talking it out. So I completely understand what she means there. Now, I tend to edit out my ramblings, if you believe it. Maybe you don't. You've listened to the podcast and go, he edits the podcast, and this wasn't a show by someone with a brain injury. I do edit the podcast, and I have no brain injury that I know of. Big surprise. So back to the article. She then numbers, I guess, the confluence of things that gave her this idea that she'll get to. So back to the article. Quote, Marie Kondo has been in the zeitgeist for a while, but especially now that she has a Netflix series. I saw the first episode a while back, and it reminded me of how having a space clean of clutter and mess really helps the mind feel clearer. Marie Kondo's spiritual approach to objects has also made me reflect upon our relationship with objects and why we feel so much attachment to inanimate things. Why can't we just let those things go? And I don't have much to say about that. I haven't seen Marie Kondo's show. I know it has something to do with if an object gives you joy, keep it. A librarian, and it will get into what we need to get rid of in libraries. A librarian has a bit more of a complicated question when we're talking about making space for new voices. What do you get rid of? And this is what she's going to get at. And so far, the premise of the article is very interesting. Like, a library only has so much space. I mean, you can add to it, but let's just pretend a library has a finite amount of space, and you can only have so many books. So what do you do with constantly new voices and new books coming in? Back to the article, and the article has quite a bit of links to it. So I'll just skip reading the links. Then I listened to this Still Processing podcast episode. If you don't listen to SP, you're missing out, where Jenna and Wesley talked about Marie Kondo and got really deep about it, as they usually do. They got into legacy and asked, what does what we leave behind say about us? They remarked on how American materialism is connect the Kondo Marie method to Shinto, and introduced to me Swedish death cleaning, a practice in which people who recognize they are nearing death start cleaning out their things so that their friends and family don't have to after they pass away. Okay, I didn't read that wrong. I mean, I've done several takes on this article already. It's just bad editing. But I tried to listen to the podcast, and from someone who I think could do a better podcast than I do, and I'm trying to get better every day, it was a boring podcast. And the Swedish death cleaning thing is interesting, but, you know, we did it with my grandma when she was getting up there. We had her put all our stuff on tables in a garage, and the family came over and took what they wanted. It's not a crazy new idea, but okay, so we're getting to this sort of cleaning out theme. And this list of things is how she came up with this idea. Back to the article. 3. I recently facilitated an instruction session for a reading and writing autobiography course where I used Marie Kondo and the Still Processing episode in an example of mind mapping. The students were going to write a personal investigative essay, so I wanted to show them how they might brainstorm their topic using something from my own life. The mind mapping I did on the board with them definitely sparked something as my brain clearly continued to ruminate. Okay. 1, damn, what a boring class. 2, it's got to be tough. Like, I mean, is she teaching you or is she figuring stuff out? Again, I'm nitpicking here. Sophia Leung is probably a nice person, maybe a really cool professor. It sounds like an interesting class and an interesting project. This is weak tea as far as the connection that we're going to get to later. But this is about the sanest it's going to get, and we're now going to dive into Crazy Town, and it's going to just get crazier. So buckle in for the rest of the show. Back to the article. 4. In 2017, yeah, this goes way back, for a White AF conference, I shared an Airbnb with Vanny Taraja. Sorry, Vanny. I probably butchered your name. I'm bad at reading names. But back to the article. An amazing librarian of color whose thinking continues to push me and who I respect and admire so much. She was also able to convince her library to send their student workers to the Joint Council of Librarians of Color Conference. She's a real one. And we had some really interesting discussions where I learned a lot. One of the mind-blowing things she shared was this idea of how our library collections, because they are written mostly by straight, white men, are physical manifestations of white men ideas taking up all the space in our library stacks. Pause here and think about this. I hope you paused the podcast and thought about it. What is it? First off, this is where I feel like this starts to go off the rails. Find me a section in the library. I'll give you the fiction section and you can choose whatever letter you want. Find me a section where there isn't someone who isn't a straight white male writing. Every nonfiction section, every fiction section, every letter, last name of an author, which is how it usually is organized, has someone that doesn't fall into that category. So I'm confused about what she's talking about because there's people of color and gay people and women all over the library. And I'm not complaining about that. I think that's a great thing. I like a diverse voice in a library. I like a diverse library. It's, you don't want all the same type of books. And I don't know a library that has it, especially a university library. So I guess a majority of the books in a library may be written by straight white males. I don't even know if you could prove that. It's probably true. I wouldn't doubt that it's probably true. But these are libraries in English. So, most people who speak English are white, at least. I guess a majority are female, but females haven't been prolifically writing until, you have a few exceptions like Jane Austen and Harriet Beecher Stowe and people like that. So Mary Shelley, there's been a lot of white women who write, and other groups have integrated into the library. It took some time, but the majority of writing was done by white men for a while. But you also have ancient texts from all over the world that aren't from European countries. So I think this is a complete misread of what a library is. So back to the article. Number 5. If you don't already know, whiteness as property is a seminal critical race theory concept, first introduced by Cheryl I. Harris in her 1993 Harvard Law Review article by the same name. Link to article in this article. She writes, quote, "Slavery as a system of property facilitated the merger of white identity and property," end quote. And the formation of whiteness as property required the erasure of native peoples. Basically, white people want to stay being white because of the privilege and protection whiteness affords under the law that they created. Harris also makes this really good point. Quote, "Whiteness and property share a common premise, a conceptual nucleus of a right to exclude," end quote. Bam! That really hits it on the head. Okay, well, there's a few things here. Whiteness and property share a common premise, and that premise is the right to exclude. True for property. See, the whiteness thing is problematic because it's constantly shifting. So, sort of, I guess, exclusion to a certain degree, but I don't know if I would agree with that. I'm generally not a fan of critical race theory. I think it has some holes and issues, but I'll just say I generally disagree with the premise. And see, they do some interesting things with critical. They'll bring up slavery a lot. Fine, slavery was a terrible thing. Then they'll bring up colonialism too, which are two different things. Like, Britain wasn't overly pro-slavery and got rid of it very early, but they were pro-colonialism. They'll point to that. Also, does it erase Native people. I don't know. I think that there's just some problems in all those quotes and statements, but we'll go on because how she ties it into library collections is really what the meat of the article is. So back to the article. 6. As I'm collaborating on this book about CRT in library and information studies, I've been having a lot of discussions on those topics with some really smart folks with an X. I had a call with Jorge, my co-editor, and Shanorda Walker, one of the OG CRT in LSI scholars, about Shenandoah's chapter, which is obviously going to be fire. Listen to her talk about her ideas, connected some dots for me, and I made the final jump to Whiteness as property, as collections. So this is the point, is all these things I lifted, the 1 through 6 ideas, sort of end up creating that Whiteness has taken over our libraries. I mean, really established our libraries, and there's no room to get rid of it. Everyone's so sentimental about those white men and their ideas and their writings that there's no room for other voices, is the premise. And she gets there and she shows how she got there with these different influences and sort of piecing it all together. Now, I although think that her idea is completely wrong, I do find it interesting to draw out how you thought about something, and it's kind of hard to do that. So I'm impressed with her being able to pull this away. But she has sort of reasons why she thinks that way, but not a lot of proof as to why it's like that. I don't know. It's a little weak, but now we get into her conclusion, which is really what people were taken aback by. And here she admits the connecting of the dots is a bit incoherent. But, so no more numbers, now it's just paragraphs. Let me now try to connect all these dots in a coherent way, as others have written. And she lists a number of articles. I didn't read any of them, so maybe they have all the evidence. Libraries and librarians have a long history of keeping people of color out. They continue to do so, which you can read more about here, another article, and from the others I mentioned above. Legal and societal standards revolve around whiteness, and libraries are no different. Okay, but libraries don't keep people of color out. Like, local libraries aren't segregated. I've never... and look, it may happen. People are racist, and maybe a black guy walked into a library in the last 5 years, and the librarian was like, nope, get out. I doubt it. I have my doubts for it. And again, talking about collections, what libraries have, there's so many diverse voices in all libraries across the country that, to me, I don't get this. They're keeping people out. Like, what? Who? Who is this great author who's written all these great works that libraries are not having in? She doesn't have it because it doesn't exist. It's not. It's a made up thing. You look around the library and you say, "Oh, there's a lot of white men who are authors here." But she's right. There are probably most of the books in the library. If you were to add up all the identities of the intersectional identities, it would probably be able-bodied, straight, white men, and maybe even Protestant. I don't know. We'll go that far. That most of the books there are written by those people. What's the percentage, though? Let's say it's 10%, 5%, with other things mixed in. If you're going to say white men, I'd be surprised if it's 50%. I really would. I'd be surprised if it's 50%. So, I've done a few podcasts and sort of books at random. And not all the ones I've done have been written by white men. I'm reading a book written by a Jew, which would probably be considered white by this person, but I've reviewed a book by a black woman. I've reviewed a book by a, as they would say, Asian, but Indian, British man, or Pakistani. I know he's in between there. Salman Rushdie. So and this is just random things. So, and I'm reading this article by an Asian American librarian, a female Asian librarian. So, me just doing this dumb podcast and sort of just picking things at random is diverse. And so it's hard for me to believe that you can point to a library and say there aren't diverse voices in libraries. So back to the article, there's 2 more paragraphs. Back to the article. If you look at any United States library's collection, especially those in higher education institutions, most of the collections, books, journals, archival papers, other media, etc., are written by white dudes writing about white ideas, white things, or ideas, people, and things they stole from POC and they claim as white property with all of the rights to use and enjoyment of that Harris describes in her article. When most of our collections filled with this so-called knowledge, it continues to validate only white voices and perspectives and erases the voices of people of color. Collections are representative of what librarians or faculty deem to be authoritative knowledge. And as we know, this field and education institutions historically and currently have been sites of whiteness. Okay, see, and now it's starting to go off the rails because what? I mean, one, she's a librarian and she's not a white person. Who? I bet you. The funny thing is, Cheryl I. Harris, her law review, her articles, you could probably find a ton of things in the library by Cheryl I. Harris. And I have a lot of problems with this to begin with. First off, what the hell is a white idea? It's baffling to me. First off, there are tons of, if you went through the eras, the old times, old Europe ideas, there are a ton that contradict and fight each other. So does that make it bad? The fact that she quotates knowledge, she says that it's this so-called knowledge, as if, what, white people shouldn't be in libraries? She would like a library with a bunch of blank shelves saying, this is the silence of people of color that whiteness has created. That's what she would like. There's a lot of good knowledge from old, dead white men. A lot of good stuff in there. And you know what? There's a lot of good knowledge from all sorts of different people in the library from a long time ago and currently. I hope that libraries have authors like Cheryl I. Harris. And I know they do. They have all sorts of critical race theory books. Every library I've ever been to has books by James Baldwin, Toni Morrison, Salman Rushdie. You can always find Art of War somewhere. The Secret History of the Mongols. These are all different ethnicities in the library. So I don't know. Again, she's a librarian. Has she ever been in a library? Because it seems like she doesn't know how a library works or what a library actually has. So I'll finish the article up here. Library collections continue to promote and proliferate whiteness with their very existence, and the fact that they are physically taking up space in our libraries. They are paid for using money that was usually ill-gotten and at the cost of black and brown lives via the prison industrial complex, the spoils of war, etc. Libraries filled with mostly white collections indicates that we don't care about what POC think. We don't care to hear from POC themselves. We don't consider POC to be scholars. We don't think POC are as valuable, knowledgeable, or as important as white people. To return to Harris' quote from above, library collections and spaces have historically kept out black, indigenous, people of color as they were meant to do and continue to do. one only has to look at the most recent incident. Then a link to a Twitter account, not an article, and I know this was in the news, at the library of my alma mater, Bernard College, where several security guards tried to kick out a black Columbia student for being black or being where he wasn't supposed to, which is actually what happened, and those guards were labeled as racist when that's not what happened. Back to the article. I still have some thinking to do around this topic, but curious to hear what others think. I'm less interested in hearing that you don't buy it, so don't bother with those types of comments. And then she gives a special thanks to someone. Okay, well, I'm going to bother with those type of comments. I don't buy it. It's ludicrous. And the fact that she goes with this Bernard College incident, which was a non-issue. It was some guy, he was a black Columbia student, but he was going where he wasn't supposed to. He refused to show ID. Now, the sort of claim he's making is that they only asked him to show ID because he was black, but they ask everyone to show ID. I've been on a college campus before. They ask you to show ID. They ask you to show student ID all over the place. And the fact that it was 10 o'clock, and Columbia's in a city, good, make everyone show ID because, you'd rather do that than maybe irritate people than have, a crime wave into your school. This is, and see, she doesn't actually make the full connection. But what it is that libraries are finite. There's only so much room for so many books. And so you do have to curate your collection. That's what a librarian does. Now, she as a librarian, I guess, would find the oldest white men and get rid of their books, and it would have to be only people of color can be added. No new books from white men. But white men are still writing, and they're writing valuable things. Steven Pinker, Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson. These guys are still writing books that are important. Especially, Steven Pinker's new book is very interesting. Sam Harris has written on all sorts of interesting subjects, and, he's a white guy. God forbid. This article is ridiculous, and I know a lot of people reacted to it. And again, there's an interesting aspect to this, and I think even a racial component, if you took it as not a racial crazy person, but just said that, there's a finite amount of room in a library, new books come out every year, we have to decide what stays and what goes, and how do we do that? If you want to talk about Maria Kondo's, and a librarian can't do that. I would prefer a librarian not do that, to pick up a book and go, does this give me joy? No, we'll replace it with a book that does. Libraries have to cater to a lot of different people, and it really has to have a diverse set of books, but not diverse by skin color, diverse by ideas, by interesting perspectives. And sometimes skin color is a part of that, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes there's so many different perspectives in this country, in this world, that libraries have to take care of. And they can't throw away all the old books because the old books are important too. So it's an interesting quandary. She brought up an interesting quandary for librarians as to what you keep and what you get rid of when, the new shipment of books comes in. And what do you base it off of? Popularity, importance? Is it a different job for a local library versus a college library and what they keep and what they throw away? Usually college libraries just expand because, they make enough money to. But it's an interesting thought that she took and made weird and racial, and it doesn't make any sense. First off, her premise is wrong. There's a lot of representation in libraries. Maybe there could be more, and libraries could do a better job doing more. And this is the problem, is the way she talks about it, as if there's all these racist librarians who refuse to have any books from people of color. There's librarians like that may exist, but they get fired shortly because the people go to the libraries and go, what the hell, you don't have these important books? So she took an interesting concept, and she may have pointed out a problem in which there's a lack of representation from certain voices in libraries. But what she did is she took it so far, and I heard a lot of people sort of bash her for this, and this is why. Because instead of saying, we could do a better job representing people of color and marginalized communities in the library, and here's how we do it. Instead, she claimed that libraries are some sort of white supremacy haven, and they're actively keeping out black folks and people of color, and it's just not true. So that's my thought on this article. I heard a lot of people bash her completely, but I think what she was going for is interesting. What do you do when your library's full and new books come in? How do you decide what books to get rid of and what books to order and what new books are important and need to be there? So I thought that was something to think of, and how do we get more diverse books, more diverse voices in libraries, and what kind of diversity do we need in the library? What diversity, what should a library shoot to be? Should it have all the popular books, or should it have some popular books? It's got to be a mix, like some popular books, but some classics, some books that people need, some research books that might be taken out, twice every 10 years, but they just hold important information that someone's going to need to know. So interesting concept, batshit crazy conclusion, and an interesting thought and experiment that wasn't done. So I'd love to see someone write this in a more rational way and not steep it in crazy race theory. All right, well, thanks for listening.